It started with a chill in the air and a missing log from my firewood pile. At first, I didn't think much of it. A single log gone. Maybe I'd miscounted when I stacked them behind the shed. Winter was creeping into Maple Creek, and I'd spent an entire weekend hauling, splitting, and stacking enough oak to get through the season. Each log was seasoned, cut clean, and marked with a faint T for Thompson, my way of making sure no one borrowed from my pile again. But the next morning, 2 more were gone. Then 4. Then a whole layer. That's when I started to pay attention. Now, if you've never lived in a neighborhood ruled by an HOA, let me explain something. It's not about lawns or fences or paint colors. It's about power. And in Maple Creek, power had a name: Karen Whitmore. Karen wasn't just the president of the HOA. She was its self-appointed queen. Everything that happened within 3 blocks went through her clipboard first. Want to repaint your door? Fill out Form 16B. Want to build a shed? Ask Karen. Want to breathe too loud on a Sunday? Better hope it's not in violation of Noise Code Section 7.3. She was the kind of woman who took Neighborhood Watch and turned it into a surveillance state. And for reasons I still don't know, she decided I was her personal project. It started months earlier with little notes. Your recycling bin is visible from the street. Your hedge exceeds regulation height. Your mailbox leans 2 degrees to the left. Petty things. Harmless, if you didn't mind being micromanaged by a woman who wore a whistle to block parties. But the firewood? That was personal. Because, see, that wood wasn't just for heat. I cut every log myself up north after my dad passed, using his old axe. The same axe he used when I was a kid, helping him build our first cabin. Every log was a memory. Every swing of that blade a lesson in patience, work, and quiet pride. And now someone was stealing it. By the 5th morning, I knew it wasn't random. There were boot prints in the frost, narrow soles, and small steps, size 7, maybe. Too neat to be kids. Too deliberate to be animals. Whoever was came at night, always between midnight and 2 a.m., always just enough to notice, but not enough to get caught. So I did what any rational person would do. I checked my security camera. Only there was a problem. My backyard camera feed had gone black 2 nights earlier. The power cable had been cut clean, not chewed, not frayed, cut. That's when suspicion turned into certainty. Someone wanted me not to see. That night, I set a new motion sensor hidden behind the stack. I rerouted the feed to my phone, added a small infrared light for night vision, and waited. The cold crept in through the windows as I sat by the kitchen table, sipping coffee and pretending I wasn't checking the feed every 5 minutes. At 1:43 a.m., the motion alert chimed. I froze. The screen flickered, static clearing, and there she was, Karen Whitmore, in her ridiculous fur-lined parka, tiptoeing across my yard like a raccoon in pearls. She looked around, crouched by the firewood, and started loading logs into a collapsible wagon. I just stared, disbelieving. Of all the people, it had to be her. Not a random thief. Not a kid. The HOA president herself. She stacked the wood, neat and efficient, like she'd done it before. Then she wheeled it across the grass, toward the side gate. The same gate she complained about being too rustic last summer. Before she left, she did something that made my jaw clench. She looked right into my camera, straight into the lens, and smirked. She knew. The next morning, I waited. Sure enough, a note appeared on my door. Reminder: firewood storage exceeding HOA visibility guidelines. Please relocate your pile 6 feet from the property line or face a fine of $250. Signed, President Karen Whitmore. It was so absurd I almost laughed. She'd stolen the wood and fined me for it. That was her game, control by intimidation. And she was good at it. I'd seen her shut down garage sales, force people to repaint fences, even call the cops on a teenager for playing music past curfew. But this time, she'd picked the wrong neighbor. By noon, I was at the HOA office, a sterile little room behind the clubhouse that smelled like printer ink and old perfume. Karen was there, of course, filing paperwork behind her desk like a bureaucratic dragon hoarding forms. "Morning, President Whitmore," I said, forcing a smile. She looked up, startled, then recovered instantly. "Mr. Thompson, hear about your violation notice?" I pulled out my phone, tapped play, and turned the screen toward her. The footage rolled, Karen, on my lawn, stealing my firewood in glorious 1080p. Her face drained of color. That, she stammered. That could be anyone. Wearing your parka? I said. Dragging your monogrammed wagon? I don't think so. For a moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the printer. Then her chin lifted, eyes narrowing into that cold HOA glare she'd perfected over years of petty dominance. You can't use unauthorized surveillance footage in HOA disputes, she said briskly. It violates community privacy bylaws. I almost laughed. You mean the footage of you trespassing? She snatched the violation form from her desk and tore it clean in half. This conversation is over. I leaned forward just slightly. No, Karen, it's just getting started. Because what she didn't know was that I'd already shared the footage with 2 neighbors, both of whom she'd fined recently for property encroachment. By evening, half the street had seen it. And in neighborhoods like ours, gossip spreads faster than wildfire. By the next morning, people were whispering at mailboxes, waving at me for the first time in months. Someone even printed a still frame of the footage and taped it to the clubhouse bulletin board. In the photo, Karen stood frozen mid-theft, wagon half-loaded, the porch light catching her perfectly. Someone had written under it, "Community Spirit, Maple Creek Style." When I drove past that afternoon, Karen was ripping it down, red-faced and trembling. She called an emergency HOA meeting that night. The flyer on every door said, "Unauthorized surveillance and harassment. Community meeting, 7 p.m. I laughed out loud when I saw it. Harassment. She had some nerve. But I went. Because if Karen thought embarrassment was the end of this story, she hadn't learned the first rule about dealing with electricians like me. We always have backup power. The clubhouse was packed that night. Folding chairs, coffee cups, and whispers thick enough to choke on. Karen stood at the front like a general before a firing squad. Chin high, posture rigid, voice trembling just slightly beneath that brittle layer of authority she wore like armor. "Residents of Maple Creek," she began, tapping her clipboard for control. "We are here to address a serious violation of privacy laws within our community. Certain individuals have been using unauthorized surveillance equipment to catch thieves," someone interrupted from the back. Laughter rippled across the room. Karen's face tightened. "This is not a joke," she snapped. "The footage being circulated online is defamatory and taken without consent. It endangers community trust." I sat in the third row, arms crossed, watching the whole performance. She was unraveling, trying to spin the narrative, make herself the victim. But the problem with being caught red-handed is that everyone saw your hands. I raised my hand calmly. "Madam President, would you like me to show the footage again? We could hook it right to the projector if you'd like." The room erupted in murmurs. Someone actually clapped. Karen slammed her clipboard down. "Mr. Thompson, you are out of order." "Am I?" I said, standing, "because I seem to recall you out of order on my lawn at 2 a.m., stealing my firewood." Gasps. Even Paul Henderson, her longtime ally on the board, lowered his eyes. Karen's lips twitched. "You're making false accusations, and this mob behavior is unacceptable." But no one was listening. A woman named Rita, who'd been fined for having a garden gnome not consistent with community aesthetics, stood up next. "So, if cameras are illegal, how come you have one pointed at my driveway, Karen?" That got the crowd murmuring again. Karen blinked, caught off guard. "That's for community security." "Funny," someone muttered. "Thought it was to watch who parks too close to your roses." The tension broke into scattered laughter, and Karen's composure snapped. She slammed her clipboard down again. "This meeting is adjourned." She stormed out, heels clicking, her husband dare trailing behind her looking pale. The rest of us stayed, buzzing with the kind of quiet rebellion that only comes after years of being pushed around. That's when Paul, the HOA treasurer, cleared his throat. "Look," he said softly, "maybe it's time we reviewed some of the HOA spending and authority boundaries." A few heads turned. I just smiled. I'll volunteer to help with that review. Because now I knew 2 things. Karen wasn't just a thief. The people around her were starting to realize it. That night, I went home with a plan brewing, not out of anger, but out of principle. See, Karen operated on fear. She bullied people with bylaws, hid behind technicalities, and relied on everyone being too polite or too scared to fight back. But fear has a short shelf life once you see the strings. So I sat down on my old drafting table, the same one I'd used back when I worked as a licensed electrician, and started sketching. If Karen wanted to keep sneaking into my property, fine, I'd make sure her next visit would be one to remember. I wasn't talking violence. That's not my way. But poetic justice? That's a language I speak fluently. I measured every inch of my woodpile area, drew out the angles, the fence line, the gate access, and where her wagon tracks had cut through. Then I started thinking about weight sensors, pressure plates, motion-activated surprises. Harmless, but humiliating. By midnight, I had a design that made me grin. The next morning, I stopped by Tony's Hardware again. The same place that supplied every one of my bad ideas since 1998. Tony leaned on the counter as soon as he saw me. "Let me guess," he said. "You're upgrading your lawn defense system?" "Something like that," I said, sliding him a list. He squinted. "Pressure switches, dummy wiring, non-lethal charge tubes, and decoy wiring caps? Marcus, you building a fortress or a prank?" "Both," I said, grinning. "I'm calling it Project Karma." He laughed so hard he almost dropped his coffee. "Just don't blow up the HOA, okay?" No promises. By that weekend, I'd installed a new security system, smarter, stealthier, and connected directly to a hidden drive instead of the cloud. The woodpile looked untouched, but beneath the logs, I'd hidden a thin mesh of hollow decoy logs. Inside each was a small canister of pressurized air powder, completely harmless but dramatic enough to make anyone think twice about trespassing again. It was harmless, but it would look spectacular. Still, I wanted evidence, not chaos. So I rigged up 4 cameras this time, 2 hidden in birdhouses, 1 behind the grill, and 1 fake one mounted high enough to distract anyone looking for the real feed. Then I waited. Sure enough, on the 3rd night, around 1:18 a.m., the motion alert pinged again. There she was, Karen. Same fur parka, same collapsible wagon. Only this time, she was moving faster, nervous maybe, but still cocky. She glanced around, didn't see the new cameras, and knelt to start loading logs again. Her gloves brushed one of the hollow ones. The moment she lifted it, the trigger tripped. PFFFFFD. A jet of harmless white powder burst straight into the air, coating her jacket, her hair, her face. She screamed, a sharp, startled sound that echoed through the quiet night. The wagon tipped. More logs rolled, setting off 2 more puffs in a chain reaction. By the time she scrambled to her feet, she looked like a snowman in heels. She stumbled backward, waving her arms, slipped on the frost, and landed flat on her back. I had to cover my mouth to keep from laughing out loud, watching it on the feed. The best part? My cameras caught everything from 3 angles. Crystal clear. The next morning, the HOA chat group was on fire. Someone had anonymously uploaded a clip titled, "HOA President Caught in the Act. Maple Creek Winter Edition." The comments were brutal. Guess the Firewood fought back. New HOA policy. Trespassers will be dusted. Powdered Karen strikes again. By noon, the clip had over 30,000 views online. Karen tried to call an emergency meeting again, but this time, nobody showed up. The board group chat leaked shortly after. Paul resigned. Rita was nominated as interim chair. And Karen? She went silent for 3 whole days, the longest silence Maple Creek had experienced in years. But silence can be misleading, because when people like Karen go quiet, it's not because they've surrendered. It's because they're planning their next move. And I had a feeling hers would be bigger and nastier. That's when I decided I wasn't done documenting. I started keeping a journal of every incident, every message, every email, every complaint. I made backups of all my footage. If this escalated into legal territory, I was going to be ready. Because you can't fight corruption by being clever once. You got to stay clever every time. And sure enough, 3 nights later, Karen made her comeback. Only this time, she wasn't alone. When a motion alert buzzed at 2:07 a.m., I already knew it wasn't raccoons this time. The feed lit up in grayscale night vision. 2 figures moving across the edge of my property. One was short, bundled in a heavy coat. The other? Broad shoulders, tactical boots, and a flashlight beam that swept the fence line with the precision of someone used to authority. Karen wasn't alone. I zoomed in. The man walking beside her had a badge on his hip. Not city security, a sheriff's patch. Her husband, Derek Whitmore. The same one who signed those inspection orders a few months ago. So this was how she planned to get even, by bringing the law to her side. They moved toward the firewood rack, flashlights cutting through the frost. Karen pointed at the logs, still dusted faintly from last week's incident. Derek crouched, muttering something I couldn't hear over the mic. Then she did something that made my stomach drop. She lifted one of the hollow logs and handed it to him like a trophy. They were trying to gather evidence. I hit record on every camera feed I had. If she wanted to play legal games, she was about to realize I'd been studying the rule book longer than she'd been abusing it. 5 minutes later, the lights of a patrol car flickered down my street. Not speeding, just creeping slow, the way cops drive when they're about to make something official. I threw on a jacket, walked out to meet them before they could bang on the door. Derek stepped forward first, flashing his badge like it was a sword. "Evening, Mr. Thompson," he said coolly. "We've had a report of hazardous material being used on community property. Care to explain?" I folded my arms. "Hazardous? You mean the decorative logs sitting 10 feet inside my boundary line?" Karen was standing behind him, eyes gleaming. "Those logs exploded, Marcus. You could have killed someone." "Non-toxic air powder," I said evenly. "You'd know that if you'd read the MSDS sheet. Or if you hadn't been trespassing again." Derek's jaw tightened. "Sir, you need to step back. We'll collect the materials and send them for testing." "Not without a warrant," I said calmly. "And before you argue, this is my land, my equipment, and I have every second of your illegal entry recorded." Karen stepped forward, voice sharp. "We have community authority. The HOA." "The HOA," I interrupted, "doesn't outrank the Constitution." Silence. Just a faint hiss of Derek's breath fogging in the cold. I could almost see the moment he realized he'd overplayed his hand. He looked at Karen, then back at me. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll be in touch." "Good," I said, holding up my phone. "Because so will my attorney." They turned back toward their car, Karen whispering furiously at him, her heels crunching against the gravel like gunfire. The next morning, the video footage, all of it, went to my lawyer, who sent it directly to the county internal affairs office. For 3 days, Maple Creek was electric. Nobody talked about bake sales or landscaping violations anymore. Now, it was about the scandal, the HOA president and her cop husband caught trespassing on private property again. Rita stopped by with coffee the next morning. "You really got him this time?" "Huh," she said, setting the mug on my porch rail. "I didn't get anyone," I said. "They got themselves." Still, word spread faster than wildfire. Someone leaked the footage to the local reporter who'd covered the last incident. By noon, the headline hit. HOA president and husband investigated for abuse of authority in suburban feud. Karen's online defenders vanished overnight. Even Paul, the ex-president who'd stepped down quietly, posted a long comment about integrity and community values. When I checked the HOA website later that day, Karen's name was gone. Acting chair, Rita Nguyen. It was official. Karen was suspended pending investigation. But if I've learned anything about people like her, it's this: suspension isn't surrender. It's just regrouping. That weekend, the weather turned rough, wind, sleet, the kind that rattles fences and makes every sound feel closer than it is. I was inside, cataloging old footage for my records, when the power flickered twice, then went out completely. The neighborhood went dark. Backup lights kicked in automatically, but something about the outage felt off. My security system ran on its own circuit. I went outside with a flashlight, and there it was. The breaker box behind my garage had been forced open. The cover hung by one hinge, wires dangling like exposed veins. Someone had cut the feed, and I didn't need to guess who. That night, while I was resetting the breaker, a motion alert pinged again, but this time it wasn't my yard. It was across the street at Karen's house. The camera I'd installed facing her direction, purely for boundary verification, as I called it, picked up flashing lights. Police cruisers. For a split second, I thought maybe she'd filed something against me. But then I saw them carrying out boxes, evidence boxes. I zoomed in. Officers were removing HOA files, financial ledgers, and what looked like a stack of unfiled fines and invoices. Rita called me 10 minutes later. "You're not going to believe this," she said. The audit turned up a whole mess. Missing funds, fake maintenance contracts, everything in Karen's handwriting. I leaned back against the counter, letting the news wash over me like warm rain. So that's why she'd been desperate. It wasn't just about pride. She'd been covering tracks. By Monday morning, Maple Creek had turned into a soap opera in real time. Karen's husband was placed on administrative leave. The HOA board dissolved temporarily under county supervision. And me? I became the accidental hero of every neighborhood barbecue conversation. But I didn't feel triumphant. It's a strange kind of victory, the kind where the villain falls, but all you're left with is paperwork and the hum of a fridge in a quiet house. Then, on the fourth night, around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Motion alert. Front gate. I opened the feed and froze. Karen. Alone this time. She looked different. No makeup, hair loose, eyes swollen like she'd been crying for days. She wasn't holding a clipboard or a phone, just a single folded envelope. She stepped up to my porch, paused for a moment like she was rehearsing something, then slid the envelope under the door. And then she walked away. No drama, no shouting, no smirk, just silence. I waited until she was gone before picking it up. Inside was a short handwritten note. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You were right about everything. I thought control meant respect. It didn't. I'm sorry. I stood there for a long while, staring at her handwriting, neat, sharp, and suddenly fragile. It didn't excuse what she'd done. Not even close. But for the first time, it felt like she understood. I tucked the note into my drawer beside the hard drives and files, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Because sometimes justice doesn't end in court. Sometimes it ends when the truth finally breaks through pride. A week later, Rita officially disbanded the old HOA charter and announced a new committee, voluntary, transparent, no fines, no fear. The neighbors cheered. The next day, I found a small potted plant left by my driveway, bright green leaves, and a note that simply read, "To boundaries, the good kind." I smiled. For the first time in months, Maple Creek actually felt like a community again. Still, I couldn't shake one thought. Karen had been quiet too long. And quiet, in Maple Creek, never lasts. It started with the smell. That faint, acrid tang of smoke that doesn't belong in a quiet neighborhood. The kind that makes you pause mid-sip of your coffee because somewhere, something isn't right. It was 2 a.m. The cameras were still rolling from the week before. I'd left them armed out of habit. When I checked the feeds, my stomach dropped. The firewood pile behind my shed, the same one Karen had obsessed over, was glowing faintly at the edges. Not blazing, just smoldering. A deliberate burn. Someone had poured lighter fluid, but not enough to destroy. Just enough to send message. The message was clear. You embarrassed me. Now watch me burn your peace. I grabbed the extinguisher and sprinted out back. The cold air bit at my skin as I doused the flames. The wood hissed, steam curling into the night. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that Karen wasn't finished. She was unraveling. By the time I checked the footage, there she was, caught in full color this time. Karen Blake, former HOA president, trespassing again, hair wild, lighter in hand. And worse, she wasn't alone. A second figure lingered near the fence, his face hidden by the shadows, but the jacket was familiar. Police issue. Derek, even suspended, he was still covering for her. I saved the footage, backed it up twice, then called 911. When the cruiser pulled up, I recognized the officer, Ruiz. The same one who'd handled everything the last time. He was tired, weary even, but his tone was sharp. "Tell me you've got video," he said before I even spoke. "I've got everything," I said. Time-stamped, high definition, audio included. He nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this call. "Okay, then it's time we stop giving her chances." By sunrise, Karen's world had officially come undone. Police tape surrounded her property. Officers moved in and out with measured efficiency. She was arrested at 6:42 a.m., not for arson, but for attempted vandalism and violating a restraining order. Derek was escorted out a few minutes later, still wearing that hollow look of a man who'd lost his badge long before anyone took it from him. It should have felt like justice. But watching him led away, I only felt tired. This was never about firewood or lawns or lights. It was about control and what people become when they lose it. The county took over the investigation. When the full report dropped, the details hit like a second explosion. Fake invoices, missing HOA funds, bribery involving city permits, even threats made under Derek's authority. It was a web that stretched far beyond my yard. Reporters showed up again, crowding the cul-de-sac like vultures with microphones. "Mr. Thompson, how does it feel to finally see justice served?" I gave the same answer every time. It's not justice until people learn something from it. Behind the questions, Maple Creek was changing. The fences were repainted. The HOA sign came down. Rita and a few others started organizing open meetings at the library. No fines, no secret votes, just neighbors talking to neighbors. Peace was starting to rebuild itself. Slow, cautious, and a little awkward. But real. About a week later, a courier dropped off a small envelope addressed to me. No return name, just legal documents enclosed. Inside was an official notice. Restitution. Karen had been ordered to pay damages for the property destruction and legal fees. $9,200 total. But that wasn't the part that made me stop. At the bottom, a handwritten note in the margin read, "I'm done fighting. You win. I hope you use the money for something good." I didn't know if it was guilt or strategy. Maybe both. But for the first time, her handwriting didn't look like a threat. It looked like surrender. For a while, things were quiet. I fixed the fence, replaced the last of the firewood. Jim and I shared a beer one evening, laughing about how peaceful everything felt. "You know," he said, raising his can, "if this were a movie, she'd come back one last time." I chuckled. Don't jinx it. But 2 weeks later, I learned that some stories don't need villains to return. Their ghosts do just fine. The first sign came from a mailman, a large man with a nervous smile who'd grown used to avoiding gossip. He handed me a thick envelope, muttering, "Found this forwarded from the station." Inside were photocopies of receipts. HOA funds used for something strange. A storage unit rented in Karen's name. The unit's address was just outside town, under a company name that didn't exist anymore. Curiosity got the better of me. I called Ruiz. "You ever hear of Maple Logistics, LLC?" There was a pause on the other end. "Yeah," he said carefully. That name showed up in the embezzlement files. "Why?" "Because there's still an active rental tied to it." He exhaled. "Don't go alone, Thompson." I went anyway. The storage facility was one of those faded concrete rows on the edge of town, half empty, half forgotten. The clerk didn't even look up when I showed him the documents, just shrugged, handed me the key, and said, "Been unpaid for months. You could take a look before we clear it." The lock clicked open with a metallic sigh. Inside was dust, cobwebs, and boxes. Dozens of them, all labeled HOA records. But mixed among them were things that didn't belong. Power tools, gardening supplies, paint cans. And in the back, stacked neatly against the wall, bundles of lumber marked with my address. My firewood. The originals. The ones Karen had stolen before I replaced them. She'd been hoarding proof, as if keeping my property locked away would somehow erase her guilt. I took a photo of everything, then called Ruiz again. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You just tied her case to the fraud investigation. She wasn't just power-hungry. She was laundering money through the HOA purchases." It all clicked at once. The fines, the maintenance fees, the invoices nobody approved. The HOA wasn't just her playground. It was her cover. The arrest made headlines again, but this time it wasn't local. The county DA announced formal charges: embezzlement, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Derek turned state witness within a week. He traded silence for a deal, testifying that Karen had been using HOA funds to funnel kickbacks through city contracts. It was over. Completely, finally over. The day the verdict came down, I was sitting by the pool, the same one she'd once called non-compliant. The water was perfectly still, the sun cutting through like glass. I thought about all the chaos, the shouting, the lies. And then I thought about the quiet, the kind of quiet you earn. That night, I walked out back to where the firewood rack used to sit. The new logs were solid, heavy, harmless. I pulled one out, ran my hand over the grain, and smiled. Because even though the war was over, the lesson was carved into every fiber of this place. Boundaries weren't just fences or posts. They were promises to protect what's right, no matter how many times someone tries to cross it. From that night on, Maple Creek was different. The kids played where Karen used to shout about property lines. Neighbors waved without glancing nervously at each other's lawns. And every so often, someone would stop by my yard and say, "Hey, you're the guy who stood up to the HOA, right?" I nod, sip my coffee, and say, "Not stood up, just stood firm." Late one evening, I sat on the porch, the cicadas humming, the air thick with that slow, golden calm of a neighborhood finally healed. Sarah joined me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Think it's really over this time?" she asked. I looked toward the fence, now bathed in soft light. "Yeah," I said quietly. "It's over. But the line stays." She smiled. "Good. Some lines are worth keeping." And as the stars came out, I realized something simple but profound. Peace doesn't come when your enemies are gone. It comes when you no longer need to fight them. It's strange how quiet victory feels. Not triumphant, not explosive, just still. The kind of still that hums beneath the sound of cicadas and the low whisper of wind brushing against new paint. It had been 3 months since the trial. 3 months since Karen Blake's name stopped being a threat and became a headline. Former HOA president sentenced for fraud and property crimes. The article was short, almost clinical. 18 months probation. Community service. Restitution to the homeowners she'd wronged. No mugshots, no grand apology, just the small bureaucratic finality of justice ticking another box. She'd lost everything. Her position, her credibility, and that thin mask of control she'd worn like armor. And for once, Maple Creek wasn't holding its breath anymore. It was breathing. Every Saturday now, I walk the edge of my property line, not because I'm guarding it, but because I've learned to appreciate what it means. Boundaries, to me, aren't fences or warnings. They're lines that say, "This is where I stand. This is where I stop you from taking what isn't yours." When I first moved here, I thought it was just land, a few yards of grass, a pool, a patch of firewood. But after everything, it's more than property. It's proof. Proof that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of courage. The kind that makes you record the truth, even when no one believes you. The kind that keeps you calm when they try to provoke you. The kind that doesn't need revenge, just evidence. A few weeks after the sentencing, a small envelope showed up in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just my name, neatly written. Inside was a single photo. Karen, wearing an orange safety vest, picking up trash by the side of the highway. Her hair tied back, her posture small. On the back of the photo was a single sentence, scribbled in her sharp, unmistakable handwriting. "I'm learning where my lines end." I didn't know if it was an apology or a confession. Maybe both. I tucked it into the same drawer as the first note she'd left. Not out of bitterness, but because every story needs reminders of how far you've come. Maple Creek changed after that. The HOA was gone, replaced by something real, something human. The neighbors started organizing monthly meetups, potlucks, yard sales, open discussions. No fines, no threats, no fear. One evening, Rita, the new community chair, stopped by with a clipboard and a grin. "Marcus," she said, "the board wants to name something after you." I blinked. "Please tell me it's not a rule." She laughed. "No, a bench, right by the clubhouse. People said you reminded them that standing your ground doesn't have to mean starting a fight." I didn't have the words for that. Just a quiet nod. Sometimes the smallest gestures weigh more than a courtroom verdict. A month later, I visited the site. There was a solid oak bench, polished to a shine, with a small brass plaque fixed to the backrest. For the man who taught us that peace stands its ground. Someone, probably Sarah, had planted roses behind it. The same color she'd once called the line that fought back. As the sun dipped low, their petals caught the light, glowing red against the fading gold sky. It was perfect. That night, I sat by the pool with a glass of bourbon and let the quiet settle in. The reflection of the fence shimmered across the water, clean and steady. No more tire tracks. No more shouting. No more fear. Just stillness. The kind that only comes after truth has done its work. And for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next knock, the next motion alert, the next fight. I was simply home. But peace has a funny way of making you reflect. I thought about everything. The lights, the cameras, the fake fines, the sleepless nights. I thought about Karen's endless need for control and how it had eaten her alive. And I realized something. People like her don't start wars because they want power. They start them because they fear losing relevance. When the world stops orbiting them, they panic. And they'll do anything, even destroy themselves, to feel important again. That's why documentation matters. It's not about catching them. It's about showing the truth in a way that outlasts their noise. By late fall, the leaves had turned, blanketing the yards in amber. Kids ran down the sidewalks again, laughing where once there had been arguments about approved play hours. The town paper ran one last piece about the HOA collapse, calling it the Maple Creek reform. It mentioned me briefly, a retired electrician whose patience changed a community. I didn't need the credit, because credit isn't what you fight for when you stand up for yourself. You fight for quiet, for respect, for space to breathe without someone trying to own the air. A few nights later, Sarah and I hosted a small dinner. Just neighbors, laughter, no agenda. Halfway through, Jim raised a toast. To Marcus, he said, for reminding us that justice doesn't always need a hammer. Sometimes it just needs a man who won't back down. Everyone clinked glasses. The sound was small but solid, the kind of sound you remember when life used to be loud and cruel. When the night ended, Rita handed me a folded flyer. New HOA charter, she said jokingly. Only one rule now. It read, respect boundaries. Respect people. Simple. Elegant. Perfect. After everyone left, I stood on the porch watching the last car tail lights fade down the street. The stars were bright, the kind of bright you only notice when nothing's clouding your conscience. I whispered quietly to myself. Boundaries kept me safe, but truth set me free. And as the cool night air brushed against my face, I realized this was peace. Not the kind you fight for, the kind you build. Weeks later, I got one last letter from Ruiz, the officer who'd stood by through it all. Short and to the point. Case closed. Officially. You did good, Thompson. Not many people handle it with this much restraint. Most would have burned it all down. You just lit the truth. I smiled when I read that. Because he was right. In the end, the only fire I ever needed was honesty. So if you ever find yourself staring down a Karen of your own, someone who crosses lines, bullies, or manipulates, remember this. You don't have to yell. You don't have to fight dirty. You just have to stay patient. Keep your receipts, and let their own actions expose them, because truth always glows brighter than their arrogance. I learned that here, in this quiet little neighborhood, where one woman's pride built a war and one man's patience ended it. Now, when new families move in, they always stop by the bench, read the plaque, and smile. Sometimes they ask, did that really happen? I nod, sipping my coffee. Every word of it. And as they walk away, I look out across the lawn, green, peaceful, untouched, and whisper to the wind. Some boundaries are meant to be tested. Others are meant to teach. The pool glows under the porch light, calm and clear. Not a hint of green, not a single ripple. Just peace, earned, protected, and permanent.